Good afternoon and welcome. Good to see you. Thank you for being here. A busy summer. I think Alan quit on us, so but it's good to be here. It is my honor to introduce Professor Michael Basler, the Professor of Law and the 1939 Society Law Scholar in Holocaust and Human Rights Studies at Chapman University in Southern California. He's the holder of a previous fellowship at Harvard Law School, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. His book, Holocaust Justice, The Battle for Restitution in America's Courts, was cited at the US Supreme Court. Another book, Holocaust Genocide and the Law, A Quest for Justice in a Post-Holocaust World, is a winner of the National Jewish Book Award, and he has testified in Congress on the subject of Holocaust restitution. He has also been interviewed by CNN, 60 Minutes, CBS Sunday Morning, Dateline, NBC, ABC, Voice of America, the Australian Broadcasting Company, National Public Radio, and BBC. It is also, I just learned from Professor Basler, which to my pleasant and beautiful, wonderful surprise, that he's also the faculty sponsor for the Chabad at Chapman University. So thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Michael Basler.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. It really is such an honor for me to be here for so many different reasons. One, I feel like you're all my family, and I was telling you I should just go up and like shake everyone's hand.
Is it possible? Yes.
Yeah. Is this better? Okay. Yeah, I was saying I feel like you're all my family. I should come and shake everyone's hand. Second, this is my second day in Aspen. It's like, this is heaven. It's amazing. So I'm very, very glad to be here. I'm also starting next week my first day of academic teaching. As the rabbi said, I teach at Chapman University in Orange County at the law school. And one of the courses that I teach is called Holocaust, Genocide, and the Law. And it's basically a course on the Holocaust from the legal standpoint. And this is what I'll be that's what I'm talking to you about today. I can't cover the entire course within a period of 45, 50 minutes, but I wanted to give you an overview. My focus today, major focus, would be not on the extermination of the Jews, the European Jews, not the genocide, but the looting, the thievery, the plunder. And because the second part of this presentation involves suing Hitler's willing business partners. So suing, we talk about litigation, civil litigation. And one of the classes I'm going to start teaching next week is a class, for those of you that went to law school, Civil Procedure, which is a first-year course for the entire year. So I'm going to be training my first-year students, okay, to do this, to keep suing Hitler's willing business partners as long as they do business. And so I want to talk about the Holocaust restitution movement, which I started looking at the end of the 1990s. So let me begin by going through some of the books that I've written in this area. The rabbi mentioned those, and just to kind of let you know the big overview. So in 2003, my book Holocaust Justice came out, and it's kind of a strange name. You know, take the word Holocaust and justice, it doesn't go together. But you'll see the subtitle, The Battle for Restitution in America's Courts. And basically the theme of that book is that lawyers as heroes. You know, every time you hear a lawyer's joke and lawyers being deprecated in the American legal system, the theme of this book that even though the Holocaust happened in Europe, the measure of justice, the small measure of justice that was achieved both at Nuremberg and with this Holocaust restitution movement is the result of American lawyers. They're the ones that made it happen. And they made it happen because of the American legal system. You can see I'm inspiring my students as they begin law school. This is what you also can do, and I'll show you some of the heroes. I then took individuals who were involved at the time in the Holocaust restitution movement, because I was the professor in the Ivory Tower reporting about it, and I'll talk about the movement in a moment, and I asked them to provide essays, kind of an anthology, all the major players. And I wanted to make sure in this book that we did not forget the Holocaust survivors, because very often books are written, and you have all these scholarly voices, historians, and I'm one of those, right? But I didn't experience it. So I made sure that 2 of the chapters are about Holocaust survivors. Right? And one of those survivors, no longer alive, said, I think a good title for my chapter would be, "Why don't these SOBs give me back my money?" It had to do with insurance. And I go, "That's a great title." He goes, "Are you kidding?" I said, "No, let's put that in there." And that's actually one of the chapters in the book. And that's the late Cy Frumkin, and may he rest in peace. He was really an amazing man. I then started looking at Holocaust restitution, and I came down from the Ivory Tower to be involved in some of the lawsuits, but then was hired by the European Union to look at something that still remains a big issue. And this is where my students still are working on this with me. And that is what I think the last chapter of Holocaust restitution is: real estate, stolen Jewish property. Right? That is in Poland, that is in other countries, that has never been given back to the Jews and no compensation paid. And at the end, I'll tell you a little bit about it and what's being done and how so far we've been unsuccessful. I've been a failure, I confess to you, for the last 6 years. I was able to succeed in one case in order to provide compensation to one family. Every other case has been dismissed, but we're not giving up. The book that I wanted to put it all together, and the one that the rabbi mentioned, I was very proud, won the National Jewish Book Award, is Holocaust, Genocide, and the Law, which is the name of my course. And that's where I go ahead and put it all together. And I talk about the Holocaust as not just a historical event, but as something that impacts us every single day. You can see as to what's going on what happened in Israel on 10/7, the pogrom on 10/7, and everything that's going on today, the crazy world that we're living in, how all these analogies, are being made to World War II. And it's part of us. It's like we are living, we think we're living in the times of the Greeks and Romans. We still speak Latin, but we don't wear robes, right? Holocaust is with us, what happened there, that particular event. Not just for Jews, for the entire world. And I talk about it in that book. The cover is a young woman, not Jewish, who testified in one of the Nuremberg trials. She was a Czech girl who at age 12 was kidnapped and Germanized because she had blonde hair. And it was lucky, because if she was not Germanized, she would have been killed. And her name is Maria Sedukova, and she is now testifying, and you can see she's holding up her hand about giving her oath about what happened to her. At the time the book came out in 2016, I was awarded the National Jewish Book Award, and they had the ceremony in New York that I couldn't go because I was in Prague teaching this course. And I went to Lidice, where she still lived, and I met her. There she is. So I just want to show you. Okay? So this is the book. She's on the cover. I got her permission, by the way, to put on the cover. And then there she is. There's Maria. She passed away about 1.5 years ago. And my mother always taught me, when you meet someone for the first time, especially a lady, bring them flowers. So I made sure I brought flowers. So it was really just an amazing day in my life, of meeting her and hearing firsthand the story of age 15 as to what happened to her. I then have another book called Forgotten Trials of the Holocaust. So this involves not the civil, but the criminal. And I'll talk a little about the criminal in a moment. This is the Nuremberg trials, taking the Nazi war criminals and putting them on trial. Now, when you say to someone Nuremberg, people will know. They're talking about the trial of the major Nazi war criminals that took place in 45 to 1946. But there was a series of trials after that that are called the later Nuremberg trials, in which industrialists were put on trial, German generals were put on trial, there were other doctors who were put on trial, judges and lawyers. You might know the famous film Judgment at Nuremberg with Spencer Tracy. That was the judge's trial. Okay? And the person who was the lead lawyer in trial number 9 is Ben Ferez. You see here, and he made the cover of this book. I showed this to my dean, and I said, what do you think that is? And he goes, well, it looks like it's 2 judges and their clerk in the middle. He is the lawyer for the prosecution, and these are the 2 German defense lawyers that are defending the Nazi generals. And he's showing them the evidence that he's about to submit. Do you see that? But Ben, he said, I started this work, I was 6'5", I'm less than 5 feet now because of everything I've done. And he was about 5 feet. I'll tell you a little more about him. He was 27 years old, had never tried a case in his life. He was told he found the documents incriminating the Einsatzgruppen generals, and he became the chief counsel, for that trial number 9. Now, here's what I want to begin, is with Auschwitz. If you go to Auschwitz and you enter the first exhibit, you will see this map. And what does this map show? Jews from all over Europe being transported to the death camps in German-occupied Poland. Auschwitz, Birkenau, Monowitz being the most famous or infamous, okay? Where there would be a selection process and they would be put to death. And you can just kind of see all over the world where these people are from. Notice that sort of the connection to even today. If you look at who's the chairman of Pfizer, okay? He is the son of Holocaust survivors, okay? From Greece, all right? And he was the one that made possible the vaccine. So you see, imagine if his family did not survive, how different the world would be. And this is a story. Imagine the Jews that had, were perished, and their children and grandchildren, their progenies, that how much this world has lost as a result of the Holocaust. And I'm sure you know this statistic, that today the population, the Jewish population of the world is less than the Jewish population of the world at the time that Hitler took power. We're still catching up to just even that particular number. Now, this particular photo is the scene from 1944. And this is taken by the Germans in Auschwitz at a train that comes in from Hungary. That was the last place where Jews were feeling safe until the Germans came and took it over. Eichmann came in, starting putting the Jews on train. This was in summer of 1944. And he was able to murder 400,000 Jews within a period of 3 months. That was sort of the evilest evil deed, not the only one that Eichmann had committed. But if you look at this photo, it has a lot of relevance that we're talking. And when I talk to my students, I tell them, look at the photo, look, what do you see? And I go around the room and I ask them specifically, what's the visual clues here? And so let me just point that out. You see, there are women and children. They're infants. Do you see that? They're carrying their goods with them. They're arriving in Auschwitz. They don't know where they are. They were supposed to be resettled in the East. Now they show up at this place. They're being taken off from the trains. They're looking at the photographer. You see they're wearing the Jewish stars, which they were required to wear back in Budapest. And they're here, and they know what is going to happen. We know what the story that is going to happen, because this is a scene of the same Jews. Do you see that? But taken from the top, and then you see the guards wearing the striped uniforms, the prison functionaries, who are not supposed to tell them as to what's going on. But they're the privileged ones. The term that was used was the kapos. But if you look towards on top over there, you see the gas chambers. Okay? But they didn't know what is going to happen. And so there now, they still have their possessions. They're being told, make sure that you mark your possessions so you can get them back. So if you go to Auschwitz, you'll see a room full of suitcases. And all the suitcases has names on it. People printed so they know who it belongs to, right? And they are told that you're going to go through a selection process. There's there on the ramp. Dr. Mengele is one of the ones selecting. And then most of the people in this photo will be gassed, right? And they'll be exterminated. Their goods will be taken from them, and they'll go to a particular area in Auschwitz called Canada. And that's what the prisoners named it, because Canada was like the place of the wealth. And they would go ahead and segregate these goods, and they would send them back to the folks at home. Okay, so this was German social welfare for Germans, because they were getting all these goods. And you can see this happens over and again. So there's murder, and alongside the murder, you have the mass theft that is going on. Okay? This mass theft, I mean, we're talking very important to these individuals, but to use the term, it's small potatoes as to what else, the Nazis had stolen, what they had plundered. The gold rings that were taken from their hands, the gold from the cadavers of the teeth, okay, also was melted, and that was used by the Germans. So that actually was much more valuable, right? And here you have Ben Ferencz, Harvard Law School, 1943. He's a staff sergeant. He then is recruited in the Army, and because he went to law school, he ends up being called by General Mickey Marcus, you might have heard the name, to Nuremberg and say, why don't you be on the trial, not of the 45, 46, but the later trials? And that's how he became involved. So he goes there. This is him at the podium. You already saw him in the Forgotten Trials of the Holocaust. He's always very dapper. I like the fact that he's got the kerchief, right? And he stays, and he convicts these generals, right? And he calls it actually AP called it the largest murder trial in history, because these generals were convicted of the murder of over 1 million Jews. In Auschwitz? No. In the killing fields of the Soviet Union, where they would come in, like Babi Yar, take the Jews, then take them out to the ravine and murder them. We know the number, 33,771. There was a report that was sent from Babi Yar to Berlin that said, we killed over a period of 3 days, 33,771 Jews. Now, that's a made-up number. Nobody counted them, but they wanted to show what a great job they did. And Ben's investigator found those reports. And the generals that were in charge of Babi Yar and the other killing fields were the generals that were put on trial. There were 22 generals, just like there were 22 defendants in the Nuremberg courtroom. Why 22? Because you know the famous scene of the defendants, I'll show you in a moment, they had only 22 seats. So that's why they took 22 generals and they put them on trial. And so Ben was tried his trial number 9 in the same courtroom. So the verdict was April 10th, 1948. I always used to celebrate by calling Ben. One time we had a ceremony in Washington, D.C. in honor of them, and this is what he ended up being, his claim to fame began that. Ben became the last living Nuremberg prosecutor. But what was not known is that he stayed in Nuremberg. He stayed in Germany. All his 4 children were born there. And he stayed in order to work on restitution, to take the property that was taken away from the German Jews, the land, other things where Germans were living, and give back to the German Jews who survived, their heirs, or to the Jewish community, which became known as the Claims Conference, which still exists today, for which Germany pays reparations, and for which the Claims Conference still provides social welfare, other support to Holocaust survivors. Numbers much, much smaller, but the Claims Conference started in 1952. So it began with Ben, and Ben was actually one of the negotiators with the Germans in order to begin the Claims Conference. But there he is at his desk, and you see it's important because he's got a couple of phones there, right? And this is his team. There's Ben, and they're all American lawyers that are working over there in order to filed the claims with the American military government for claims of Jews for restitution. Right? Ben reached 100. We celebrated his 100th birthday. He was the last living prosecutor of the Nuremberg trials. And he died on April 7, 2023. I was participating in a conference in Washington, D.C. in January 2023, and we gave him a standing ovation. He was too ill to attend that conference, but I called him afterwards and told him, Ben, this is what happened. And a few months later, if you want to learn more about him, and he's just an amazing man, this is the website, and there's a wonderful documentary that was made based upon an interview that 60 Minutes did, Leslie Stahl, with Ben Ferencz. It's called Prosecuting Evil, The Extraordinary World of Ben Ferencz. Find it on your streaming channel for a number of years. Netflix had it for free. Now you have to find it with somebody else. All right. Now we go forward with the Holocaust restitution movement. Remember that gold from the gold rings? That was melted. The gold that was taken from the treasuries of the countries that Germany conquered, that also was taken. That was melted down. Where did that gold go? It went to one country, Switzerland. Switzerland was neutral. And the idea, the historical memory that Switzerland had is that, oh, we were the good guys. Germany would invade us because we would defend. But that was not the reason, because they were very useful. This is where the Germans, the Nazis, could do business. And the Swiss National Bank, which is the equivalent of our Federal Reserve, bought the largest amount of gold that was stolen from the treasuries and what is called now victim gold. All right, so you see, in 1998, there's actually a cover story, 1998 in Time Magazine, Echoes of the Holocaust, the fight over Nazi gold reminds us. You see what the subject is about? And so in the 1990s, to me, that was, oh, this is interesting. I think I want to look at this some more. And so I began looking at this, and I held a conference, invited people about it, and I'm still working on it. I'm here talking to you about it. So then at that time, there were a number of books that were written on this, exposés. Hitler's Stalin Partners, Swiss Banks, Nazi Gold, and the Pursuit of Justice. You see that? Now, there was another claim that was made against Switzerland, because once you discover the wrongdoer and you see one crime, you find, oh, they committed other crimes. So the other crimes they committed is this. Prior to the war, Jews who wanted to keep their money for safekeeping put it in normal Swiss bank accounts. And they were told, this is the place that's going to be safe. One of those was a man named Joseph Sapir. This is his daughter, Estelle Sapir. She's testifying in Congress, and she shows a photo. Behind her is Senator Alphonse D'Amato from New York. And she's talking about the fact that before the last time she saw her dad, he told her the name of the bank where he deposited the money, the Swiss National Bank. He made her memorize the number of the account. And she survived. She goes to Switzerland, give him my money. And the bank says, interesting. So you're Estelle Sapir? Yes. Joseph Sapir? Yes. Okay. You're claiming you're the heir. Okay. Show us a death certificate. And I understand that. When my mom died and I, inherited her, what she had in the bank, I had to prove my death certificate. But in the context of the Holocaust, they didn't give out death certificates in Auschwitz. So they kicked her out. And she went and lived in Queens, ended up basically forgetting about it until 1990s in filing a class action lawsuit against the Swiss banks. Okay? And that began in 1998. Other lawyers came in, they filed a lawsuit. This lawsuit came in front of one judge, also a hero, Edward Corman, K-O-R-M-A-N. He's still a sitting judge in Brooklyn. And he, at that time, was the chief judge. He brought all Swiss banks together, and he said, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and rule on your motion to dismiss, because you're saying that How does a U.S. court have jurisdiction over this case? This all happened over there, even though the people are here. But you know what? I want you to settle this, because if you don't, you're still going to have a public relations problem, because people know now you've been exposed. And so he ended up getting, in 2000, the Swiss banks to settle for $1.25 billion, okay, which is a large amount of money. And that was a class action settlement put into a fund by which survivors who could prove that their ancestors had money in a Swiss bank, they would go ahead and make a claim. It took them 19 years to disperse that money. Okay? This is a letter from Judah Gribbetz and Sherry Reed, the special master and the deputy special master who Judge Corman appointed to say, make the distribution, okay, make the claims. How did they do that? Some people knew, some people didn't. So the Swiss banks published lists, and there are lists like they're in New York Times, page after page. I looked for the name of Basler. Sorry, nothing came up. So I'm still teaching. I didn't get my Swiss bank account. Then my grandfather, who ran a tavern, I never met, and was killed in the Holocaust in Warsaw, but it wasn't there. Okay? But you can see how long it took. But this is a success. It's really, these are amazing people who ended up doing, they're really heroes of this movement. And that's why I named them, I show them so you know them. Okay? And how they became so important. Right? After the restitution settlement with the Swiss banks, and I call this in Holocaust justice the mother of all restitution litigation, the floodgates of litigation opened in a good way. You had other claimants. So there was another set of claimants, similar claims. Well, our families didn't have money in the Swiss banks, but they had insurance policies. And what about those insurance policies? It's a life insurance policy on my dad and my mom. They perished. Pay me on the policy. The largest insurance company that sold policies to the Jewish world, I never heard of this company before, Assicurazioni Generali from Trieste, the largest insurance company in Italy with an office in Israel, and it was known as a Jewish insurance company because it was started by Italian merchants in the town of Trieste. So survivors would tell the story. Well, I remember the agent would come, they would give us the calendar, and they would collect the premium for insurance every single year. And my parents would sometimes say, well, I'm sorry, I can't get you a birthday present because we now followed this policy. And so class action lawsuits began to be filed against Generali, against Allianz Insurance, against other insurance companies that ended up, basically doing the same thing. This lawsuit was filed in California State Court by the Stern family. So this is in state court. Morris Stern was a wine merchant in Czechoslovakia. And he had a Generali policy, right? This is before the war. His grandson files the lawsuit in Los Angeles, and that lawsuit is not dismissed for statute of limitations. And eventually it is also settled. How do they settle? Using the model of the Swiss bank settlement. They created a commission called the International Commission for Holocaust-Era Insurance Claims, ICHUC. And then they published lists, and you will go look at the list. I looked again. Maybe, my grandfather had an insurance policy. No Basler again. But many people did. I teach this course, and I used to teach it with the late Justice Richard Feibel, his family came from Germany. And he found his parents' names, he knew, and he applied to ICHUC, and there was some restitution that was given. Small amount. We're talking about nothing. This is just a measure, a small measure of justice, okay, for the fact that there was profits made by these individuals, by these companies as a result of the Holocaust. Then, finally, a third set of litigation, and that one finally focused on the Germans, the major perpetrators, but not against Germany, because you would have sovereign immunity, but against the various companies that profited from the Holocaust. So this is a tour being given in Auschwitz III, Monowitz, which is an industrial plant that was built by IG Farben, the successor is Bayer, Aspirin, other companies, the big conglomerate, and the tour is being given by the executive IG Farben to the SS leader Himmler. Do you see that? And you see the construction over there? So what do? They ended up building these construction sites, and then they would employ slave laborers. The slave laborers wouldn't be paid, the SS would be paid. Do you see how it worked? Now, that was good, because these individuals who were slave laborers were the ones that were more likely to survive, because their calorie count was higher. Do you see that? And so you know many survivors said, I survived Auschwitz, but I was a slave laborer for Krupp or for some other company. So when Cy Franken said, why don't these SOBs give me my money? He talks about the story about like Elie Wiesel, him and his father being shipped off to a concentration camp. And they were made to work, and they both survived. Now, these individuals, again, are working for Krupp. These laborers have it better. Why do they have it better? Anybody see? They're working on the outside. They're working in the inside. Okay? This is Poland. It's cold. It's colder, I think, than Aspen, during the winter. All right? And they don't have the kind of protection of food and clothing. So they also are survived. And meanwhile, these companies are making profits from them. And they're paying a piddly sum to the SS, nothing to the slave laborers. There are also another one. You have women working. Do you see that? Even in the ghettos, they had industrial shops in which individuals worked, making uniforms, for the Nazi armed forces. And then in the later Nuremberg trials, one of the trials, not of the generals, but with the industrialists. And one of the industrialists was Krupp, K-R-U-P-P, which was one of the largest firms. Alfred Krupp, who's here as being given a medal by Hitler, he was put on trial at Nuremberg in the very first trial. It was determined that he was senile. The prosecutors made a mistake. But at the time they filed their indictment, they named the wrong Krupp, because the person that was running the company was his son, Alfred, right? And they wanted to change players, and the judges said, no, this is not a baseball game where you take out one player and put another one. Sorry, okay? So Krupp was not put on trial. But in the later trials of industrialists, there was a Krupp trial, and there's Alfred Krupp sitting, you see, as a defendant in the dock, okay, being tried as a Nazi war criminal. Albert Krupp, then claims being made, again, by Ben Ferenc in Nuremberg for slave laborers. Do you see that? So this claim is made, and there's some pittance that is paid, but that doesn't, protect these individuals for crimes against humanity, for war crimes, different kind of proceeding. And this is what happened. It hurts. It really hurts, okay, to see this kind of injustice. And while I really commend the Germans, the post-war generation, what they have done for many things, all right? There are still streets named after Krupp. There's a professorship in the university that's named after Krupp. There was a story in the New York Times last year by an investigative reporter who I talked to last week, who says the Germans have to change this. They can't have, people who are convicted Nazi war criminals. But let me show you what happened to him. Okay? There he is on the dock. Here he is on the cover of Time magazine. Okay? In 1957, after he's released. Now he's called Industrials Krupp. And this is a story, on Time magazine, telling about the German economic miracle, right? And how well he treats his workers and how great he's doing, right? So he basically rehabilitated himself. And because of the Cold War, now Germany, West Germany, they were our friends. So this is Mr. Krupp. Right? Come 1990s, and you've had these lawsuits, class action lawsuits being filed against these German companies, right? You have these ads. This is an ad in the New York Times. This is not an ad paid by Mercedes-Benz, okay? Do you see why? Okay? And it's basically naming and shaming. There was another one called Bayer's Biggest Headache, and it had an Alka-Seltzer. There was another one that showed an assembly line, the one I showed you, okay? And it says the assembly line that Ford does not want you to know about, because Ford Motor Company had a plant in Germany, which they also employed as slave laborers. So as a result of the naming and shaming, in 2000, the same year, the German companies and the German government settled. And they settled for 10 billion Deutschmarks, or $5 billion. What is that money? That money would go to slave laborers that were still alive, the majority of whom were not Jewish, all over the world. And if they were still alive, they would make a claim. And if they worked under a harsh regime, they would get a check, one check, for $15,000. If they worked under a less harsh regime, they would get a check for $5,000 and an apology letter from the president of Germany. Okay? So this is part two. In addition to the compensation that was paid after the war as a result of what Ben did. What the Germans wanted was one thing. They called it legal peace, meaning after we do this, you cannot sue any German company anywhere in the world having to do with World War II. And in order to do that, we want the US administration, okay, to bless this settlement. So President Clinton and Secretary Eisenstadt, Stuart Eisenstadt, who was the chief point person in this, and he wrote a book called Imperfect Justice, who also is one of the heroes and still works on this theme, ended up getting the settlement in 2000. And survivors all over the world would be able to got that check. Now, the last part of Holocaust restitution movement that began in the 1990s was Nazi-looted art. If you remember Holocaust Justice, the cover of that book has the large paintings being held by soldiers. These are GIs that are walking out of a castle, okay, of plundered loot, plundered art. Well, there were other better places to store plundered art. And the amount of art that the Nazis stole was more than all the art that was found in the museums in the United States at that time. Okay? Amazing, the amount of art. And most of it still has not been recovered. This is a gold mine. Why? Perfect humidity. Do you see that? And when Germany is being bombed, they're safe. So all this art is now discovered. It goes to central depots, and people like Ben are in charge of returning the art to the museum from whence they came, and for the individual collectors who say, no, this belonged to my family, or I survived the Holocaust. Here's proof. Photograph of my living room. Do you see the same piece of art? Now, I want to make a point. The Germans did not kill the Jews to take their art, right? Not every Jew was a rich art collector. But you can imagine that there was a significant minority, of Jews who were art collectors, who were industrialists, who did financially well. Yeah? And so this is the art that was plundered. And so a case finally reached the United States Supreme Court regarding this case. So does anybody know what the case I'm talking about? Pardon me? The Klimt case, right. There was a movie made about that. Anybody know the name of the movie? Woman in Gold. See, I'm like a law professor, right? I call on people, and it's like Woman in Gold. So I'm going to tell you this story. Okay? This is the painting, The Woman in Gold. It's a painting by Gustav Klimt of Adele Bloch-Bauer, Jewish, okay? And this is the Bloch-Bauer family, Adele and Ferdinand. He was much older. They both came from wealthy families. It was an arranged marriage of two wealthy Austrian Czech families. And they didn't have any children. Adele died of meningitis right, prior to the Nazis coming into power. In her last statement, she said, Ferdinand, I want you to donate these Klimt paintings to the Austrian National Museum. 1938, the Nazis come, right? All of a sudden, the situation changes completely. Ferdinand is on the run. He is saved, and he goes to London. He then writes up a will, and he says, I give all my possessions to my nieces and nephews. He doesn't want to give it to the Austrian National Gallery. This country betrayed him. Do you see that? Yeah. Hitler was Austrian. Here, this is what they did. You know, some of the most infamous Nazis were Austrians. So you don't give money, paintings to them. And so the niece is Maria Altmann. She's able to survive. She and her husband Fritz come to Los Angeles, where I live. 1939, she opens a dress shop. And many survivors remember going to Maria Altmann's shop, and they would purchase from them. Maria Altmann, this is her, at the time the lawsuit was filed in 1998, and a reproduction of the painting, right? And she said she always thought that this painting, okay, and others, were given to the Austrian National Gallery by Ferdinand. What she didn't know, and this is in the movie, that it was actually stolen from Ferdinand, and there was an Austrian investigative reporter that found that out. And in fact, the statement giving possession to the Austrian National Gallery, everything you have to do by title, you got to change the title, it had Heil Hitler at the end of it, saying we now transfer these Klimt paintings to the Austrian National Gallery. She says, give it back. It belongs to me. She sues in Austria. She's unsuccessful. She then hires a young lawyer named Randy Schoenberg, who graduated from USC Law School. Excellent school. That's why I went to law school. And Randy ended up filing the lawsuit. He was working as a young associate in a larger law firm. He says, can we take this case on a contingency basis? The law firm says, no, we don't take cases on contingency basis. And there's no precedent, for this. He quits, okay? He's hungry. He starts working with another lawyer, and it's in the movie. He has family already, and he files the suit. And this suit goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Okay? And the United States Supreme Court, Altmann versus Republic of Austria, allows this lawsuit to proceed. And after the lawsuit is allowed to proceed, the Austrians say, would you like to talk settlement? I say, okay. And Randy says to Maria, listen, let me do this. If we're going to win, we're still going to lose. It's going to take an appeal, another appeal, another appeal. Okay? They want to arbitrate. Where? In Austria. They want to arbitrate on the Austrian law. They want to have Austrian arbitrators. Okay? The lawyers in the room. What would you advise your client? Yes or no? Do it or don't do it. Take the case to trial. She said, okay. Right? And they went, they had 3 Austrian arbitrators who ruled that under Austrian law, there was no will. It was just a statement that Adele made, and the will that Ferdinand made, that it said, everything goes to my nieces and nephews, was good. So the Austrian National Gallery, to its credit, packed up those paintings and sent it to Maria. She doesn't need it in her little house where she is. So it goes, show at the LA County Art Museum for safekeeping. And I went to see it. And I have to tell you, it is an amazing, amazing painting. It's been called like the Mona Lisa, right? And you see the original. It was bought by Ronald Lauder, the Lauder Cosmetics Empire. He's an art collector. He's built a museum called the Neue Gallery, Neue. His family is also from Austria. Next time you go to New York, go to the Newer Gallery, okay? Pretend you're in 1930s Vienna, and you can see this particular painting. There it's there. He bought it for $160 million, which at that time was the largest amount of money paid for any work of art. Okay? Randy Schoenberg is now retired. He lives in Los Angeles. Every time I still see him, he has a great life. He's a really, really nice man. There's a documentary, you can look him up. But you can see the success story. Imagine me next week talking to my 1L law students and say, you too can be Randy Schoenberg. Yeah? Imagine what you can do. Okay? So, oops, I have this here now. Okay, I love this. So, there was a movie that was made. For those of you who have seen the movie, see the movie. It's streaming. Right? Maria Altman was played by Helen Mirren. Right? And Ryan Reynolds played Randy Schoenberg. And it tells a true story of what happened, both in Austria. There's a younger Marie Altman, and Helen Mirren is the Marie Altman, that is today. So it's about this litigation, and they did a really wonderful job. I show it every single year at Chapman University. And I love this poster, because you can see the image is you've got the lawyer, okay, leading the client from darkness, do you see? Into light. From swastika, okay, over into light. And the caption is, the fight for justice never ends. Okay? Imagine, this is it. This is why you want your children and grandchildren to become lawyers, okay? Because you want them to fight for justice and do something like this. Okay? Now, this is the military tribunal that I told you about, the original one, where the defendants, had sat. The first major Nazi war criminals. Hermann Göring was the one that was the chief, because Adolf Hitler committed suicide. There were the other guys, and then these same chairs were used for the 22 generals that Ben Ferencz had tried. Now, all this ended. And so in Los Angeles, we have the largest community of Armenians outside of Armenia. One day I get a call from an Armenian attorney, says, Michael Daisler, yes, we want to do the same thing. Right? Armenian genocide. Those Turks, you know how they feel about Turkey. Right? They wouldn't even recognize that what happened to us is a genocide. Right? In Berlin, there's a memory to the murdered Jews of Europe. Where is that? In Istanbul. Where is that in Ankara? Do you see that? They still deny it. But he says, you know what? There is cultural objects, their version of Judaica, Christian objects that were stolen. And those objects, okay, one of them, manuscripts, is at the Getty Center. How many of you have been at the Getty Center? Okay, you should go when you're in Los Angeles. What are they? They are 5 pages, okay, from an Armenian Bible. Where's the Bible? Is in Yerevan. Where are the pages? At the Getty. Were they torn? Yes. What do they look like? Like this. Okay? They're illustrated pages. Adam and Eve. This is going back to 1267. Right? An Armenian Bible. They were torn and they were then sold. And eventually the Getty bought those. So he says, I want to sue the Getty. I want to file that model. And he says, I want to go from lamentation to liturgy, because he goes to church, to litigation. You see that? From lamentation to liturgy to litigation. And the New York Times actually did a story of Vatke Sagayan, again, one of my heroes, the late Vatke Sagayan, who began the Armenian genocide restitution movement. He sued New York Life Insurance Policy Company because they sold policies to Armenians, and he was able to get a settlement. And then he fought against the Getty. We were representing the Armenian church. We tried to settle the case. We couldn't settle. We were going to go to trial. And then the church said, how would you like to reach a settlement? And we did. We never went to trial. What is the settlement? Okay? In the provenance, the listing, the chain title, they changed that. And do you see what it says in yellow? Can anybody read that? Okay? Now, what does that mean? Do you know when that gift was made? After the lawsuit was settled. So they recognized the title belonged to the Catholics. And the Catholics says, you know what? These 5 pages can be best preserved at the Getty Museum. So you get to keep them. Right? So there was an instant ceremony. Do you see that? With the Catholicos dressed in robes. If you look up the case against Getty, Western prelacy of the Armenian Church of Getty, you will see that. We are now continuing with that movement. Oops. That's not that. With the conference with UCLA, what's next? Armenian genocide restitution in the post-recognition era. We now created a new term, AGLA, A-G-L-A. Nobody knows about it except the people working on our team. Armenian genocide looted art, right? And last summer, not the summer before, the summer before that, we had law students and art students survey every museum in the United States that would have an Armenian art object, and to see whether any of those objects could be AGLA, okay? Armenian genocide looted art, right? And we have the whole list. I will tell you, we identified 2 objects that we have suspicion that might be AGLA. They were recently bought by 2 different museums in the United States, and we're going to approach those museums, just like Randy Schoenberg did, just like other people did, and say, excuse me, what you have is looted art. Give it back. And we have a conference at UCLA on this particular subject. We're going to have another conference at Chapman University in January talking about AGLA 2.0. What next we'll be doing with this. Now, the timing that we are doing this is very, very interesting because, this is the one, right? National Geographic, do you see? Cover story. Because what are people talking about now? Colonial art. Art that is stolen from other countries, okay, by Europeans, that made its way to museums all over the United States and all over the world. And now it's going home. Do you see that? We have the person who is the author of this, a British journalist, speak at the conference. And these are art objects from the Kingdom of Benin. This is where Benin is, okay? And they were in a museum in Germany. And there was a ceremony. Do you see that? Where the king of Benin in a particular province ended up getting those sculptures returned. All right? Now, what's next? The Parthenon at the British Museum. But if you look at stories, there are stories every single day. The conference we had at UCLA was at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. And the Fowler Museum itself saw that they had Native American objects. And they said, you know what? Let's do a provenance research. And they found a particular tribe to which these objects belong to. They said, it doesn't belong in this museum. It belongs, to this particular tribe. We're going to give it back to you. And there was a ceremony. So you see how all this, it's kind of the litigation opened up. And Holocaust restitution litigation is going on right now, including, do you see, every single war, there's mass murder and there's mass plunder. So we know that plundered objects stolen from the Ukraine war are going to end up on the market. There are plundered objects that ISIS took when they conquered parts of Iraq that also made the market. Right? This is the book again. This is my website, me and the director of the museum in literature. Okay, and this is in April 2017 when that award ceremony took place. And then Polish Jews. So let me just finish with Polish Jews really quickly. This is a pre-war photo. Okay, 3.3 million One of them was my dad. Born in Warsaw in 1922, age 17, he flees. He's the only one that survives. He has the good fortune, right, of fleeing to the east and being arrested by the Soviets and shipped off to a gulag. And I'm saying good fortune, because if he stayed there, in 1941, the Germans would come, conquer that eastern part of Poland, and he will be murdered. Right? And so you can see, and he was all I know about my grandfather, his father's a tavern owner. What property they had, I have no idea. My father never talked about this, right? Most of these individuals that survived actually survived, like my dad, by fleeing to the Soviet Union. Okay? And this is Warsaw today. You see that? This area of Warsaw, this is where the Warsaw Ghetto was. Okay? So these buildings are built by modern construction companies, right? But the land itself, right, was Jewish-owned land that was confiscated by the Germans, that was then privatized by the first Polish government, and then nationalized by the communists, okay? And never given back. And it is still a hot button issue. You might have read in the news, there was a very big rupture between Israel and Poland, where Poland would say, we're not going to even allow Israeli students to come and view the camps because of this, because you're calling us all murderers and we were all saviors, of Jews. That's a whole other story. But it was such a rupture because they said, no, we are not paying for compensation. You want to pay compensation? You want to get compensation? Go to the Germans, not us. This land doesn't belong to you. We're not paying any compensation or restitution. So I was involved in a conference that I put together in Warsaw. I published an article on it. I'm still working on this. I've been working on it for the last 5-7 years. I've been completely unsuccessful, except for one family, a brother and a sister. They're able to get some compensation. But we'll see. One never knows. And this is where I end, and I end with Mama Lusha. My mom was born in Ukraine. In 1941, the bombs started coming down. She and her family fled in a wagon in their cow. I even know the name of the cow, Malka. And they ended up getting on the train and ending up far, far east in Uzbekistan. They came off the trains. They had absolutely nothing. You know who saved them? The local Uzbeks, the Muslim population of Uzbekistan. And that's where my mom and dad met. They married, right? I am the product of that marriage, their oldest son. Since my dad was still a Polish citizen, in 1957, when I was 5 years old, we moved from communist Soviet Union to communist Poland. So my children joke, Dad, you're like a product of two communist regimes. I go, yeah, and they were different. I experienced communism, USSR style and Polish style, right? And then we came as refugees to the United States. We were brought by Hayes. We had no family here. And they said, we're going to put you up in Minneapolis. I remember my dad looking at the map, right? We went to Minneapolis, and this is where I became an American. Because I learned about baseball. You see that? And Minneapolis is my hometown. I love to go back there. I still root for the Twins. This is where I learned about Hershey bars and Kellogg's pork flakes and everything else. This is in 1964. Coming as an 11-year-old boy. So you can see why I say God bless America. Okay. But I end with Der Mama Lusha, this says Gedenk in Yiddish, which means what? Remember. Remember. Thank you.
still speak other languages and you renegade in other languages?
Yes, that's good. I speak Russian with a Polish accent and Polish with a Russian accent.
An American would know how to say it.
My Russian gets better and my Polish gets better every time I have some vodka. And if you listen to me, people tell me they hear some kind of an accent. I came at age 11, so sort of like the gap year. My brother and sister were younger, and I very much wanted to be an American. I didn't want to speak other languages. I wanted to learn English. I wanted to be just like all the other American Jews.
You go to the lake.
Pardon me?
You go to the lake.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I have to say, I did get my Polish passport back. My dad was a proud Pole, and I didn't want the Jewish community to be destroyed. You know, 2 Polish presidents said the following quote: there is no Polish history without the Jews. There is no Jewish history without Poland. Okay? And so my daughters, okay, are also going to be Polish citizens because their dad is a Polish citizen. Okay? Because that very small community, okay, should still exist. We were there for 1,000 years. Okay? And we can also be Poles. Whatever. Yeah. Yes.
In the beginning of your discussion, you were showing a map where from all over Europe, people were sitting. Now, what does this have to do with the life insurance policies from all these? You talked about the German life insurance companies. Is there any life insurance companies from those who perished from other places?
Yes.
And are they making restitution?
Yes. In other words, the lawsuit that I showed you, the Stern lawsuit, that lawsuit was against Assicurazioni Generali. That's the Italian insurance company. So insurance companies that are still in existence today, that at that time sold policies to Jews, who are a successor to those companies, were sued in order to get restitution and saying the statute of limitations is not told, okay, and you can still get it recovered. And there was a grand settlement that was made by which a fund was established following the Swiss bank model. And then names were listed, and you would look at that list and you would see if your name was there, and you would make a claim. And some people did it. And that finished like 2010. I can just turn it off. Was the last time ICHIC, the International Commission for Holocaust Era Insurance Claims, made the last claim.
Yes, thank you.
I was wondering in terms of Polish citizens for your children, and my mother is also survived from Poland.
I'm hard of hearing something.
Right. What is the purpose of becoming a Polish citizen to reclaim the fact that there were Polish Jews there, or
To keep the Jewish heritage.
to keep the Jewish heritage? And what is the Polish government? What's their response if if American applies for Polish citizenship?
But who is it? If you talk to Holocaust survivors who survived in Poland, the majority of people, 8 Poles,
Don't want to go back.
they are about, they want to speak Polish, they said that the Poles were worse than the Germans. I get all that. Okay? I get all that. There's 2 sides of the story. The other side of the story is that the largest number of righteous of the nations recognized by Israel, the largest number that are Christians from Poland. Now, there's a reason, because there were so many Jews to kill and so many Jews to save. Okay? But I can't blame every Pole. So every time I go to Poland, I don't look at the eyes of every Pole and see them for someone. I look at the friends that I have. That are trying to keep Jewish culture alive.
wonderful organization, I'll say, you know, look up, called Forum for Dialogue. And what they do is they go to the Stephanus, where there were Jews there, and they teach high school children. And the high school children then create a walking tour of Jewish life in that particular city. I did one of those in the city called Białowieża, which is in southern Poland on the border with Belarus. And those kids, they didn't even a Yiddish play. They never seen a Jew in their life in Białowieża. But there were Jews there. And we had a ceremony about the Jews that were murdered in Białowieża. And then when the Germans came. So I think we have to keep both sides of the story.
But my specific question was the government of Poland, which wants to keep.
Depends, so the answer is yes, depends on which government. Okay? No government, okay, in Poland, since the end of communism, has been anti-Semitic. Now, there is no anti-Semitic policy. The communist government was. We left in 1964. We stayed 4 more years. I'll probably be speaking either Danish or Hebrew. Because in 1968, there was an anti-Semitic campaign by the communist government. And the Jews were told, leave. It was after the 67 war. That has to move on. Now, are there individuals who don't like Jews? Are there anti-Semites? I'm sorry, there's lots of anti-Semites, you know, in the United States. My God, what we're seeing today, what I see on my campus, I never would imagine. You see that? So, it's a very strange kind of situation. I have Polish Jews that tell me that when they are in Warsaw, you know, wearing a yarmulke, they feel nobody's going to bother them. Everybody's open. Today, when you go on a college campus and you wear a yarmulke, who knows what might happen to you? You see that? So it's a